Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Claire Scantleberry from the Nanotech Industries Association, and I am delighted to welcome a rapidly growing crowd to our webinar today dedicated to the future of nanomaterials within REACH. I can see that we already have over 25 attendees in place and lots more people arriving, so we will get on with the webinar. So we will keep everybody on mute if that's okay, just to keep the audio quality high for the presenters, and when we get to the Q&A sessions we will be very happy for people to unmute themselves and ask their questions. Alternately, you can write your questions in the chat function on your control panel, which I'm just showing you where it is now, and I've just written hello in there. So you're welcome to ask a question at any time during the webinar using the chat function and verbally in the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. So I think without further delay, let's get started. So we want to say a big welcome to everybody, and we are delighted to see the level of interest in the webinar today. The focus today is to really provide a summary of the latest developments within REACH that are where references specific to nanomaterials are now active. And the webinar is aimed at all organisations associated with the use or development of nanomaterials, those that are either already active and want to understand more about how they're going to alter their regulatory preparedness, or those becoming active and would like to understand how they have to prepare for REACH regulation. We will introduce the changes in REACH annexes and also look at how organisations can put this into company strategy. And we will also give a quick overview of how companies support members within regulatory preparedness. And at the end of that, we will have a quick Q&A to see what questions people have and to hopefully give you as much information as possible. I am getting a comment from somebody that you can't hear me very well. So can anybody just write me a quick note if they can hear me okay? And hopefully this is just one person that's having an issue. Oh, okay. It seems to be fixed now, so that is great. So without further ado, I will get started on the webinar and give you a quick introduction to the Nanotechnology Industries Association. As you might imagine from the name of our organisation, we were developed to support the development of nanomaterials successfully to market. And this covers all aspects of nanotechnology and nanomaterials, as it's a complex development pathway that goes right back to basic early stage research through to commercial scale up and entry into markets. So we help our members in a number of different ways. We very much work to support the development of a regulatory framework that allows the safe development of materials to market. We also provide business and scientific networking for our members because, as you will know, nanomaterials are often highly specific to the type of material or the type of application or to the market that you are targeting, and often opportunities are overlooked in other markets and other materials applications. And to help do this, we work with the European Commission, we work with member states, we work with our own members and a wider stakeholder community to help understand and build the whole ecosystem in which nanotechnology is delivered. So we work from Brussels as our head office, and we are represented in Belgium, the UK, Netherlands, and a mixture of Sweden and Portugal. And we bring skills across the portfolio of nanomaterials development, and hopefully, and we work with our members as much as possible to make best use of their own skills in also helping to support the wider network. A very quick look at what we do to support our members. Our primary service, and why members usually come to us initially, is for our regulatory support, and that is really reflected in the number of people that are now in this webinar today. So we monitor regulatory developments on a global level. So it could be either at an individual country level, at European level, or at international level. And to help members be as prepared as possible, we have a series of consultations and position papers and are always liaising with our members to help them understand what they need to do to successfully reach market. We are represented at a number of different expert bodies, both scientifically, standards and policy level, to help understand where regulatory developments are taking place and to help support industry effective ecosystems. We also work very much with our members, as I've already mentioned, on a business and scientific networking basis. So we work across a number of other industry associations in partnership to ensure that they get the best insight into how nanomaterials are impacting that sector, and our members get to see where nanomaterials may be applied into novel sectors. We also help to build the overall international ecosystem for nanomaterials and nanotechnology. So we take part in a number of international projects, and we are increasingly involved in activities such as Safe by Design, where we see a strong pathway leading forward for industry development. And finally, we work across as many global connections as possible. We've already said that we work across sectors and countries, so we are globally represented, and we work with organisations from around the world to help develop nanomaterials and nanotechnology. This is a quick look at some of our members, and as you can see, it's an extremely diverse family that we have. Our members do span all different sectors and all different countries, and the entire life cycle of the nanomaterials and nanotechnology development pathway as well. So our earlier stage research is often addressed through our university members, going through to translational research and early stage innovation through a number of small to medium enterprises. And this goes right up to large international companies such as 3M, BASF and Solvay, who work across all sectors, as we've already said, and are both producers and users of materials. Our nanomaterial members are supported by specialist members, including organisations like Everest and Yordas, who have a valuable role in helping people understand the effective development of nanomaterials. And we also have a number of associations at national and international level where we can work on a much higher level to encourage nanomaterials development. So, my final slide before I hand over to David Carlander, our Director of Regulatory Affairs, is to introduce really how nanomaterials are developing. Because, of course, with the opportunity of very quickly advancing technologies and applications comes the challenges of turning those into market-ready and market-taken-up products. So as we know, nanomaterials and nanotechnologies are highly novel at producing innovative products and applications and are defined as a key enabling technology, which means they are intended to be applied across all sectors and all products to significantly advance European, in particular, competitiveness. But of course, this brings complexity, and the management of nanomaterials is a complex one. It poses challenges for risk assessment and for regulatory development. And this is really what has led to the changes in the REACH annexes that we are discussing today. Europe, as its very nature, is precautionary. It has been experienced in the past, as many people will know, particularly with issues such as the GM crop scenario, that it will seek to be highly precautionary and look at whole life cycle safety and assessment before allowing full market access. And the regulations are really adapting to respond to advances in nanotechnologies now. And this will see a shift in resources from companies in particular away from R&D into regulatory compliance. And it's really important that materials developers are aware of this even as early as when they are setting up their companies, because the budget for taking a material to market is going to have to also focus on very solid regulatory work. And as you will see as we go through this webinar, there are often quite significant differences between countries and between sectors for regulatory compliance. And to be aware of this helps an organisation be ready and able to successfully reach market in a lot of different scenarios. And so it is very clear that early safety investment and very transparent safety investment will maximise the market access for a product, and not only reaching the market, but also the duration of the product on that market as regulations develop further. It is essentially future-proofing the ability of your material to stay on the market. but I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know. So I'm very pleased to hand over now to David Carlander, our Director of Regulatory Affairs, who is going to introduce the changes in the REACH annexes for everybody today. So thank you very much, David.
Good morning, everybody. I hope that you can also hear me very well. So I will be happy to present in the next couple of 8 or so slides the issue of REACH and how the recent developments of adding nanomaterials into REACH have come about. But before just going into the more specifics, you may also have been aware that earlier this year in March, the European Commission presented a general report on the operation of REACH and review of certain elements. So this was a review that was not nano-specific. But in this general REACH review, which was the second one, there was obviously the issue of nanomaterials was mentioned. So it was stated that REACH, and we fully support that, is of course able to address emerging issues such as those from nanoforms, but there is a bit of lack of specific information requirements. And what also is mentioned was that some scientific gaps remain as to the suitability of test methods. And for those of you who have been in the field for some time, you are certainly aware of the OECD sponsorship program that has been running for many, many years now, where the outcomes are now being used with a large support from European OECD members to update and revise the OECD test guidelines. So moving over to the next slide, which is really the nitty-gritty of the what we're presenting here, the revision of the REACH annexes. This is just the one slide overview of the timing that has happened. So the Commission, after many, many years of deliberations with member states and stakeholders, presented their proposal in October last year, and earlier in this year in April, the REACH committee, which was composed of the member states, adopted unanimous, with full support from all the member states, the modified REACH annexes as we see at the moment. However, it's not just the text as such is not yet presented as a regulation because it's currently undergoing the 3-month scrutiny by the European Council as well as the Parliament. But we don't expect any large changes to this. There may be 1 or 2 editorial changes, of course, some of them which we are likely to point out in our communications with the Commission. But hey, the regulation as such is composed of 2 parts, or the adopted text. The actual Commission regulation, which is a very short regulation. It has 3 articles, and one of them is referring to the annex to the Commission regulation. And that is the bulk, that's the text where the bulk of the changes have been introduced, and it reaches about 27 pages. The most important aspect of the changes now to the whole REACH regulations by changing the annexes is that now there is a regulatory definition of nanoform, which is based on the European Commission recommendation from 2011, and this nanoform definition is now inserted in Annex VI into the REACH regulation. There are a number of other definitions as well in other types of regulations, for example, in the biocidal product regulation, in the food regulation, as well as in the cosmetics. So unfortunately, there are currently a number of definitions of what is a nanomaterial, or as in the case of REACH, what is a nanoform. And the regulation itself will become applicable from 1st of January 2020. So next slide, please. There are a number of nanospecific modifications, and unfortunately, just so you are aware as well, 27 pages of quite technical and detailed regulatory text. We will not manage to cramp it all in this webinar, but we will touch upon the major aspects. So what is referred to, so the annexes are changed with like an introductory general clarification that if nanoforms are covered by the registration under REACH, they must be addressed. There must be an assessment performed and the conclusions must be documented, and appropriate risk management measures must be identified. This is in a sense similar to all substance registrations under REACH, but is now also further specified that for nanoforms, you need to do that for the nanoforms themselves. It's also, what is done is that you have modified text in a few of the annexes of REACH, not all annexes, but especially in Annex I, Annex III, and Annex VI, which is the main annex where the changes are, as well as Annexes VII, VIII, IX, X, and XI. So all the annexes that are related to the tonnages specific provisions have been made. And the following slides, we will go into some more details on this. So it's, again, it's not an exhaustive analysis. We have that prepared for our members, but it's to give a bit of the flavor of what the main changes are and how they can be addressed. So next slide, please. So in Annex I, for example, there is the issue related to exposure and how to perform the exposure estimation. So this states that when you have your nanoform covered, you have to characterize the dissolution rate, the particle aggregation, the agglomeration, and the particle surface chemistry, and you have to include that as part of your exposure estimation. So this is certainly, as you will also see for a number of instances, expanding quite a lot the information requirements that are now required under REACH. Moving over to Annex VI, which there will be a few mentions of Annex VI here, which is the main annex on how to fulfill requirements, definition of nanoforms, as well as a set of similar nanoforms. And again, it comes back to the definition of a nanoform is referring to the Commission recommendation from 2011. So for those of you who are aware, it's particle number size distribution, 1 to 100 nanometers. It also includes aggregates, agglomerates, as well as some exemptions, such as for single-wall carbon nanotubes, graphene, and fullerenes. What is the main difference when it comes to the nanoform definition is that in the 2011 recommendation, the word incidental is included. And obviously for REACH, you are not registering an incidental substance. You are registering a substance, or a nanoform in this case, that you are actually manufacturing. So there's not a need to include the word incidental. So next slide, please. There we also talk about a set of similar nanoforms, and that is the regulation now allows for creating a group of similar nanoforms, and this is expected to be done by setting a number of boundaries, and of course all of this is done by the registrant themselves, because it's still the requirement is of the registrant to actually define your own substance, including the nanoforms as well as a set of similar nanoforms. And this set of, or this, how you create this group, how you set the or how you describe and set the boundaries for your set of similar nanoforms also needs to be justified. But in practice, we would say this is still quite unclear, and certainly the ongoing work by the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, to update and provide guidance will be very, very important with this regard, how this will be managed in practice. So next slide, please. This is also, in a sense, related to how you are defining your nanoform. So in section 2.4 of Annex VI, there is now the requirement to do the characterization of nanoforms, and quite a few bullet points that you will see under 2.4.1 to 2.4.6. The main aspects is to look at the number-based particle size distribution. You have to look at, describe the surface functionalization or the treatment. And you also have to provide information on the shape and aspect ratio of your substance, as well as finally also the surface area. And these requirements have been discussed for quite a long time, if they would be sufficient to characterize a nanoform. And we certainly believe that they are, although some of them may still be quite difficult to comply with, especially when it comes to the description of the surface functionalization and surface treatment, and the identification of each substance that is used to provide this surface modification. So next slide, please. So the whole issue of a nanoform, and this is now some of the issues that we have identified, and we have identified a few other issues as well. How to work with this in a practical point of view. It's stated, for example, in the text that a nanoform cannot be part of different sets. So you have to really look into how you are describing a set of similar nanoforms. So in our view, there is not yet a common understanding what is considered a nanoform. And certainly this is causing, or has the potential to give rise to a number of uncertainties, and possibly what we'll see again, maybe the having to get back to the ECHA Board of Appeal to try to clarify this. But we are hoping that the ongoing work with the ECHA in their setting up a PEG process, their partner expert group, there's a process for stakeholders to be engaged and involved, and NIA, as many others, we will be involved in this process, so we can have a good understanding and clarification how to build a foundation so industries have a joint and common understanding on how to work with a nanoforms and set of nanoforms. We should also recall that from a monitoring purposes, once the materials are out on the market, the whole issue of nanoform and nanomaterial is still a very, very complex and difficult to do from a regulatory monitoring process. Next slide, please. So a few mentioning of some of the issues that are mentioned specifically in the annexes themselves is, for example, in Annex VII, which is related to substances, most substances, basically all substances, as they are produced in more than 1 ton, which is the minimum threshold. So for nanoforms related to water solubility, information on the dissolution rate shall be considered. And again, of course, dissolution rate it's sounding quite easy and straightforward, but finding the appropriate and validated test methods may not always be easy and straightforward, as they are still discussed to some extent under the OECD aspects. It's also stated that the acute oral route shall be replaced by inhalation route, unless, of course, inhalation exposure is unlikely. And this also states now that the ecotox studies that are performed at this threshold from Daphne algae cannot be weighed based on high instability in water alone. So moving over to the next annexes, more than 10 tons, there is a number of further physical properties that shall be considered if it influences the hazard or the exposure. Indirect genotoxicity should also be looked at. So there are a number of aspects that is further now required for nanoforms. There are other examples as well, such as dustiness that has to be provided. Mentioned, for example, that the in vitro gene mutation study in bacteria, which is normally referred to as the Ames test, may not be is not needed for nanoforms. So moving over to the next slide, please. Oh, I should have mentioned this slide, that there are also required for the Annex VIII and Annex IX and Annex X as well, which is related to the 100 and 1,000 tons thresholds. And especially what is also being required is the issue of providing more information related to kinetics, because toxicokinetics shall now be considered, including the recovery period for nanoforms. It's quite another extensive test. But we didn't go into too much detail on the higher thresholds in just this presentation, but there are further requirements for the higher thresholds as well. So basically, what does this mean for the consideration for companies? So, well, in general, yes, as you can hear what we just presented, more information is now required where nanoforms are part of the registration. Specifically, it's the additional physical information that is required not only for characterization, but also for the hazard and exposure assessments. So what that means is, of course, within your own organization, within your own company, the substance stewardship is of increasing importance, as well as we do know now that all the CFs, the substance information exchange forms that were required before the last reach deadline here that happened in May, they are not part of the legal requirement anymore, but they are still strongly advised by ECHA as well as the Commission, and I think also by many industries to continue the work in a CF-like form. So that is really where part of the stewardship can take place. There is, of course, the need to update substance dossiers. It's a requirement of REACH. You may have seen that from the overall REACH review that there is some concerns that this is not happening to the extent that the Commission or the ECHA would have liked. So indeed, there is a need to update, keep the dossiers up to date. And for a number of this, because REACH, as you all know as well, is also rather, it's a complex regulation, there may be a need to, within your organization or your company, to consider a dedicated REACH service provider for advice on the testing and compiling the dossier, because the target date, January 1st, 2020, is not that far ahead, especially considering that ECHA's guidance documents, I would assume that we're not expecting to see those updated, and even though there are a number of guidance documents already, that they will be updated based on the Reach Annexes adaptation now, and eventually adoption, and when it will be published as a full regulation. So that will mean that there's not a lot of time to update and remind the nanoform information requirements. So the next slide, please. So it's reaching now. Well, the last deadline, as I indicated, 31st of May, to register the phase-in substances have certainly passed. So in total, you may have seen we have more than now 20 on the EU market. And currently, the ECHA is checking the completeness of all registrations, and they are publishing, they have said they will publish updated figures for their completeness check by September. So you can go in and search the database. So as of today, or actually yesterday, 29 substances have been registered to have a nanoform. But then again, this number will increase as the database is being updated. So on the 31st of May, I think it was 26 substances, and now we have 20. Slowly but surely, we will see update of the numbers that are registered as a nanoform. So next slide. And this is just to present again the overall NIA REACH position or official REACH position. So we certainly, as an association, we welcome the adaptation because it clarifies that nanomaterials are explicitly included in the REACH regulation via now the specifics detailed in these annexes. We do see that the revised requirements provide some certainty, and especially we believe that we will see now an increased uptake again, because now we have the regulatory clarity in a number of sectors, well, in most sectors where nanomaterials are already used to a large extent, as well as also nanotechnology. But we should also recall and recognize the additional industry resource burden that may impact some sectors more than others. And to some extent, a number of the concerns that we are aware of is, of course, our members and people that have a direct interest in working with nanomaterials. They are already aware because they're using these nanomaterials for a specific purpose. But there are also many, I refer to them as more conventional or traditional industries, that because now there is a definition of a nanomaterial, may now their products may actually now be defined as a nanomaterial or as a nanoform, and therefore they may not have been fully aware of all of these implications. And so that's where we see that some sectors may be certainly more impacted that are not currently aware that they are working with nanoforms. And lastly, but certainly not the least, in the 2011 recommendation from the European Commission of the nanomaterial definition, that has been long delayed and is tentatively scheduled to be published as a revised document, because there are a number of issues with the definition itself. It is, we have heard at the meeting last week that the Commission is planning to publish this public consultation before the summer. It will be a public consultation open for 12 weeks. So whatever happens to the changes to the definition, the recommendation for that definition, that may not be impacted, or it is unlikely that the REACH annexes, as have been adopted now, will be updated before the 1st of January 2020. So there again will be another definition of nanomaterials and nanoforms in Europe. And this certainly hampers and affects the whole issue of regulatory certainty and compliance, and just causes a lot of unnecessary complexity, which no one is very happy about, and certainly not the industries. So we'll have to see how this will pan out, and certainly NIA will be very active in also providing input to the public consultation or the revision of the nanomaterial recommendation. I think that is my last slide. I'm going to hand over to Reach. No, sorry, I will also do this again, just to tie into what I just said on the nanomaterials definition. So looking also on the opening up our horizon scanning and looking also outside of Europe, there are more than 12 worldwide definitions. Most of them obviously are still in Europe, but also there are another number of standards. So the ISO and CEN are also having definitions of what is nanomaterial and nanotechnologies and so forth. And what we do see in a number of the regulations is that there are a number of exemptions, and of course all of this do pose this challenge to compliance for industry. So yeah, this is a bit what I mentioned. The public consultation is expected before the summer, but then again, it's been delayed for a number of years. So we'll just have to see when it will be published. And I think by that, I hand over to Claire again.
You do. Thanks very much indeed, David. And we had our first question through the chat function, which I will save up and get to when we have our Q&A session. So thank you very much. So as we were talking about, we would like to support members and other organisations to be as ready as possible for continuing changes in nanomaterials and regulatory frameworks for them. And there are increasing numbers of resources to help them do this. Particularly, we always recommend going to look at the EU Observatory for Nanomaterials, because they have increasing resources available to organisations to help develop a fully rounded picture of their own nanomaterials. And they've just published recent data sets such as eNanomapper, which are now publicly available for the first time, which we would strongly recommend that people go and have a look at. And we would also ask you to share your experiences with NIA, because it is through shared experience, through good practice, through bad experiences, that organisations will be better prepared for future regulation. So I'm going to wrap up the webinar and talk about how we're supporting our members. And our overall priority is to ensure that members do get through REACH smoothly. And that involves the whole value chain. So for earlier stage researchers, it's incredibly important to understand the type of information that is going to be requested from nanomaterials produced commercially. And this is the same across all sectors. If you want a successful translation of an innovative product or process, you have to understand the constraints and pathways that later stage developers of that material are going to face. And so you're going to have a much higher success rate in transforming materials into commercial development if they are headed in the correct regulatory direction. And for our small to medium enterprise members, it's incredibly important that they have accurate budget and timings and understanding of the skills requirements that they are going to need to take their materials successfully to market. As many people will know, in development of innovative materials, the innovative step itself in the early setup of a product is only a small part of the resources and skills needed to actually take it to market. So we very much want people to be supported and prepared for access to market. So we have been working with our members we've presented the Reach Annex updates in a lot more detail to members and helped them understand where it's going to alter their own in-house practice and requirements. We are developing our final position on the Reach Annex updates with wider organisations so that there is a strong and sort of coherent industry voice in response to the updates. Our Global Regulatory Working Group has actually been very active in this area for almost a year now, and it's one of the priorities for members was told to us that they wanted to look at the challenge of nanoforms and how they are managed within a regulatory perspective. And this was before the Reach Annex updates were published. So we work on a continuous basis around how nanoforms should be managed by companies in the development. And as part of that, we are working with CEFIC and ECHA to host a joint meeting looking at how nanoforms and nanoform sets are managed within REACH. We also support our members with essentially on day-to-day updates wherever we can find them through our regulatory monitoring database, which is where we track all major regulatory platforms and requirements across the world. We have a quarterly regulatory priorities webinar for our members where we look in detail at the most important topics that are currently around. Our regulatory digest then follows that up with the latest written information about regulatory changes that may be relevant to members. And of course, being a membership association, we are always on the end of the phone or an email to help members and to help build up a critical list of frequently asked questions. So we're actually going to give you a pitch now, of course, as you have come to our webinar today. Say a lot of organisations, as I mentioned at the beginning, join NIA because of the regulatory support that it gives them. And as we are an annual membership organisation, we would like to offer anybody who would like to get started a 4-month trial from September to December, whereas we usually make you join for the whole year. And this will allow you to look at member activities and member support and assess whether it works for you over a shorter period of time. So this is a sort of low-cost way to see how effectively we work for you, and then you could renew fully in January 2019. And our different types of membership include corporate members, who are materials producers and users, our associate members, which are essentially most other organisations involved in nanomaterials production. It may be including service providers and consultancies and other for-profit organisations. We have a non-profit and academic research category as well, and we have our associations category. So there's room for everybody inside NIA to help contribute with their own skills and learnings, and also undertake skills and learnings from other NIA members and from NIA itself. So if you would like to follow up on that, I would invite you to contact me directly, and we could have a conversation about how this might work for you and how we get it started. And so finally, the follow-up to this webinar today, we would very much like to share the slides with you. And we realised because this didn't require any registration for the webinar, we don't necessarily have everybody's email addresses. So we would invite you to send your email address through directly to me through the chat function of the webinar, and you can do that. You can either send it to everybody or you can select to send it to NIA directly. So we would invite people to just add their email addresses into there if they would like to receive the slides after this meeting. And we have a short survey that we would also like to share with people to make sure that we have given you useful information and what we could do in the future to help you develop. So on that note, I will go to questions. And we had a question earlier, to which I will open the floor with here, saying probably the biggest impact would be on manufacturers and importers of nanomaterials and nanoforms of those substances. And I'm asking what would be the expected impact on downstream users of materials. So David, perhaps I could invite you in here to talk about the experience of nanomaterials users in relation to regulatory changes for nanoforms and nanomaterials.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, indeed. The whole supply chain issue and the impact of downstream users will, of course, also be to ensure that the rather complex line of communication that is foreseen and described in REACH will be followed. So indeed, the revision of material safety data sheets, as well as the extended ones looking into exposure estimates, where their communication both to the downstream users, so ensuring that they are aware that the substance may or may not be in nanoform, will be required, as well as to the downstream users that are using a nanoform, that they are ensuring that their material providers include this information and for their exposure assessment, etc. So this, as I'm sure you also are already aware, it's still it's already a rather complex process, but it is in place and it's working. So that is that would be my advice. I also know, Claire, if I can move over to the next question. I saw an issue related to the nano definition.
Yes, hang on, let me scroll back here.
Oh yeah, maybe.
I don't want to have missed anybody's questions. We have a question around the consultation period. Is that the one that you refer to?
I see a question. Do you have information on what is the trend regarding the revision of the ESA recommended?
I have one before that, if we can start with that one first, which is the, could you explain more about the public consultation by the Commission this summer?
Yes, so I think I will do these questions in tandem. So getting back to the recommendation from 2011, where the European Commission provided their view of what is a nanomaterial. There was a provision foreseen that after 5 years this should be revised, and we are now a bit late in this revision. So the Commission has run a number of stakeholder engagements to get input, especially with the help of the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, to get input on how the recommendation is working, what are the problems and what are the difficulties. So what they have said also, more or less officially, what the changes will be. Basically, the principal aspects of the recommendation will not change. They will be similar, but not exactly the same. So we're talking the recommendation will still be applicable to materials. So we're not doing products or components. It will be based on size, because again, size can be measured and therefore you can be upheld and use that in the court case. But it aims to say more that it will be more specifically related to solid particles, where the external size is within 100 nanometers. This will also mean that nanostructured materials are excluded. So a good example of that is, for example, computer chips that these days are produced in industrial scale, with the gaps being between 5 and 10 nanometers. They would not be regarded as nanomaterials, but they are nanostructured and thus being enabled by nanotechnology. The idea is also, currently the particle number size distribution is in the range, it's a threshold between 1 and 50%. But because the Commission argued that no regulation has suggested another threshold, so they are planning now to fix the threshold to 50%. Further, what has been also a big issue, and I think this is how it could be, again, create some difficulties within the REACH annexes, and if they would not be modified, is that how do you prove that your material is not a nanomaterial? So the recommendation will likely say that by using the volume-specific surface area of the proposal is 5 square meters per cubic centimeter, that would then not be a nanomaterial. So, and then we also, is a suggestion to look at these exemptions that we have in place now that are actually defined as being nanomaterials. Currently, we have single-wall carbon nanotubes, fullerenes, and graphene as, by the recommendation, they are defined as nanomaterials. But as technology has and science has progressed since the publication, we do have a number of substances that are not carbon-based that have similar structures. So the Commission is currently looking how this can be addressed, if there should be a broader inclusion of more materials, or if there should be an exclusion, or if there can be a generic description. So basically, this is what the public consultation would look like. And if they will publish, as they have indicated, but it has been delayed many times, if they will publish this before the summer, it will be open for 12 weeks public consultation. So anyone interested can provide their comments and views. And after the public consultation, the Commission will assess the comments and then revise if they feel it's applicable, and then publish an updated revised recommendation. Time-wise, I would not foresee this to happen this year. Earliest, I think, the guesstimate will be early next year, unless there are like no public comments that are challenging the Commission view. That is what I would say. I do hope I answered most of those two questions.
It was a pretty comprehensive answer. Thanks, David. But we can throw you straight into the next question now, which is, will the issue of isolated primary particles versus primary particles within aggregates and agglomerates be solved? Is the revision going to address this, and how? Good question. I think what we will foresee is, the understanding is that aggregates and agglomerates will still be part of the definition. And they talk about identifiable, consistent, constituent solid particles. So indeed, how this will work in practice, I think we will have to some extent, rely on guidance. And guidance is, I should also mention, that is foreseen to be published jointly, a guidance document from the European Joint Research Centre to support the application of the definition. So I'd say it's not 100% clear. Again, that's the whole issue of agglomerates, for example, that are more easily separated, and aggregates, even large aggregates, if they are composed of constituent solid particles. We've already seen some
might be rather unfortunate applications of this concept. So yes, I think we still have to wait a bit and see.
Okay, thanks very much. And we have a question to clarify: will fumed silica be a nanomaterial or not?
I think I don't want to reply yes or no directly. Of course, it could still depend on how you would look into this issue of the constituent solid particle, but in general I'd say yes, but then again you have to look into the specifics of your process and your material.
Okay, I've got a few more comments or questions here. So I'm just going to say, sorry, I'm just reading and talking at the same time, which is never very productive. We're saying from one of our participants today, many inquiries for inhalation and ecotox testing, but no large contracts. Possibly ECHA guidance will be required before the testing starts. When do you think the testing strategy will be fully clarified by ECHA to allow safety studies to be implemented? Which I think is a relevant question, because we always talk about the really important development of the commercial services side of nanomaterials development. And of course, you're not going to get that until you have the regulatory clarity, which will allow companies to then invest in those tests. So David, can you cast any light on when we think testing strategies will be available?
It is indeed a very good question, and one that has also been raised also by ECHA, as it certainly creates a number of complications and difficult issues. If ECHA is to provide guidance, and basing their guidance as is usually done based on the OSD test guidelines, and if the OSD test guidelines have not been fully updated, revised, or validated, it is indeed and of course difficult for ECHA in turn to base their guidance on the OSD test guidelines. With that said, that is certainly a complication and complex, and industries are aware of it, ECHA is aware of it, and I think depending on how urgent it is, I would foresee that we will see the ECHA guidance documents being more or less available, at least in the draft form, before Christmas, may even be adopted before Christmas. But that only leaves like 1 year to perform the testing and do the assessment, which is certainly not enough time, as well as the issue of finding testing laboratories that will be available and can do this. However, also with that in mind, I think that we, as we are also as NIA, we are heavily engaged in the OSD sponsorship program, working with the revision of the OSD test guidelines, and we're also engaged in a number of the European projects that have provided information or are ongoingly and currently providing information to revising the OSD test guidelines. That there is an assessment can certainly be done on what would be likely to be required. But then again, it would still be, of course, better to make a final decision and set up the testing based on what ECHA actually requires, although the draft OSD test guideline may already be available. So depending on the urgency, and there is a lot of preparatory work and a lot of understanding that can be done and performed based on already of information that you can find based on the OECD work that a number of stakeholders and of course also member states are engaged in, and certainly us as NIA.
Thanks very much for that, David. I'm just scrolling to see if we have any more questions, and we would welcome if somebody wanted to unmute themselves and ask a question now. I will leave a respectable time for people to do that in. No, I think people either are, there's plenty of food for thought there, and you're also very welcome to follow up with questions afterwards. So I think we're really essentially coming to the end of the webinar now. So this is a quick reminder that if you would like to receive the slides or to follow up in any way, please either email me through the address that we have here, both myself and David, or send your email address through the chat function to me directly so that we will share the slides with you immediately after this webinar. And as a final comment, we set up a quick survey, which you can see also in the chat function here, that to help us understand if this was useful to you and how you would like to see future activities develop, because it's very helpful for us to understand what our wider community is looking for. So I would like to say a really big thank you to everybody who made the time today to attend, and also to David for his, as usual, incredibly in-depth analysis of latest regulatory developments. We would be delighted to follow up with anybody who is interested about the test session for NIA membership, and we will send you the slides as soon as possible after this webinar. So if there are no further questions, I would like to say thank you very much indeed. And after almost exactly 1 hour, so a perfectly timed webinar, I will wish you a very constructive afternoon. I will wish you any good lucks that you might need for the football later today and later this week, and look forward to talking to you in the future. So thank you very much indeed, and you are now free to go.